to have people there that are leaking information, that are talking to each of you to try to have their public policy implemented because they're getting you to argue on their behalf, and we know it's happening. These people should be fired. They should be out of government. They're disloyal to our government, and I hope that that's what's going to happen.
The chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee is sounding off on government leaks based on this next story. The Washington Post has obtained and printed the transcripts of President Trump's phone calls with Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull and Mexican President Enrique Pena Nieto from earlier this year. Note that the transcripts had minor spelling and grammatical errors, including misspelling Turnbull's first name, which are preserved here. In the January 27th call with the Mexican leader, President Trump pushed his promise of a border wall, saying it put both men in a, quote, political bind. He urged Pena Nieto to drop his public resistance and instead say that the two leaders will, quote, work it out. He added, quote, if you're going to say that Mexico is not going to pay for the wall, then I do not want to meet with you guys anymore because I cannot live with that. The president also said, believe it or not, this is the least important thing that we're talking about, but politically, this might be the most important talk about. And you may recall that President Trump said earlier reports that his call with the Australian Prime Minister Turnbull were contentious, were fake news, and that the call was very civil. However, the transcript reveals otherwise.
What a surprise.
With Trump interrupting Turnbull at one point in the heated discussion on a refugee deal, saying, quote, as far as I'm concerned, that is enough, Malcolm. I've had it. I've been making these calls all day, and this is the most unpleasant call all day.
So he
Putin
said, so wait,
was a pleasant call.
So he said, so Donald Trump said it was an unpleasant call.
Yeah.
But he said it was fake news. I don't understand.
He said the reports that it was an unpleasant call was fake news.
But he
was
said
undermining
it was
the
fake news.
truth.
I don't understand.
The president was undermining the truth,
I am
and that's
so
part of
confused.
his sort of thing
But I'm always
that
confused.
he does.
You know, it was
It
interesting
just
when he
hurts
was
more this time.
It's just to undermine the truth.
When he was referring to the wall, you know, he said this is really not an important thing, but politically, it's the most important
Well,
thing.
that's
He knows exactly what that wall is.
He's not building the wall. Clint, so before we go to a reporter, very interesting yesterday. You had people like John Podhoretz, obviously a Trump critic, saying, reading these transcripts, I love these things as much as like eating the biggest hot fudge sundae ever. I absolutely love it. And yet it's horrible.
Yeah.
It's terrible for the country. Yeah. It's a dangerous precedent. This should never happen. I heard that from Obama people who have been going after Trump nonstop, who said, this is outrageous. I can't imagine. I'd be going crazy. I think Tommy Vietor said,
6 months
I would be going crazy.
Maybe in history.
If somebody were leaking transcripts of President Obama's calls with foreign leaders. How dangerous is that?
David Axelrod said the same.
Did David
yesterday.
say the same thing?
Yeah,
you're going to have bipartisan calls for this now.
I think this something
and
different
part
going
it's
on.
going to come down to they're worried that any more leaks can really undermine both the Mueller investigation, other things that are going out there. If you look inside the White House, Kelly is now moved in. This is one of his top things. McMaster has talked about this repeatedly, the leaks inside the White House. And so there has to be a lockdown because it affects foreign policy. Now, part of it is prompted, I think, by two things. One, the chaos inside the White House and the constant knife fights that are going there and people pushing one way or another. But also when Trump goes out publicly and bashes the intelligence community or bashes parts of law enforcement, Department of Justice, or press, then that incites this.
And also when he lies about the conversations, about what happened. Somebody inside the government may say, wait a second. That's not what happened at all.
Exactly.
He is lying to 300 million American people and also to the world. And there are, you know, the more he lies about what's going on, the more people, the more whistleblowers are going to feel the need, Gene.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, there are ways, as you know, to issue statements about conversations like that that are not lies, that don't explicate the entire conversation, the entire back and forth, but that aren't flat out lies. And he just told flat out lies about what was said and what was not said. But you know, in all my years in journalism, I don't think I've ever seen this. I don't think I've ever seen private conversations between the president and another world leader leaked in their fullness.
And Willie, we conservatives, and I put myself at the top of the list, I was enraged when the Washington Post, in 2005, 2006, printed the locations of black sites across Europe from allies that had made a really tough political decision to help the United States in what we call war against terror. And I thought that was so reckless, because they said, who's going to help us now in the future? This takes it to an even higher level, where now if you're a foreign leader, you can't even call the White House without being afraid that every word you say is going to spill out in the front pages of the paper in your home country.
Well, it does. The transcripts don't make Donald Trump look good, but they also don't make the presidents of
Right.
Mexico and the Prime Minister of Australia look great either. They're talking about, I have to say this publicly because this is happening behind the scenes. If a foreign leader doesn't have the confidence that what he's discussing with the President of the United States isn't going to go wide, isn't going to be on the front page of the Washington Post, they're just not going to talk. They're just not going to talk to the President of the United States because because it hurts them at home. Let's go right to the reporter who broke this story, who got some of the transcripts of President Trump's phone calls, national security correspondent for the Washington Post, Greg Miller. Greg, good morning. Always good to talk to you. I suspect you're not going to reveal your sources to us here on national television, but can you share a little bit about how these transcripts fell into your hands?
Yeah, not so much, but I mean, I will say, look,
So
these
Donald
are.
Trump called you and said, you want some transcripts?
Yeah,
I got a legal story, right?
Look,
That's
stranger
what happened.
things have happened.
Stranger
right?
things have happened,
Yes.
indeed. And many people are speculating that may have happened. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah.
I think Gene is right. I think you guys are all right. That this is extraordinary, and we recognize that when we obtain these transcripts. This isn't the kind of thing we're accustomed to seeing, even those of us who cover this stuff for the Washington Post. But these are extraordinary conversations that a president of the United States is having. These are conversations in which he's referring to one of the states he governs, New Hampshire, as a drug-infested den.
That's unbelievable.
And saying that that is why he won that state. He is subjecting a very, very close ally, a country that has fought alongside the United States for a century in every conflict, to a stream of invective and abuse, really. And so these are extraordinary conversations. I don't know what would have happened if a prior president had treated an ally or a leader of a close neighbor this way. Perhaps we would have seen transcripts like that in those cases.
Question about your source. Were you surprised to get these transcripts? How hard was it to get these transcripts? Are you concerned that you're being played?
I'll answer the last question. Of course, I mean we're mindful of that. We're very mindful of the environment right now in Washington, the hostility towards news organizations like ours. I mean, the president himself has described journalism as an enemy of the people. And so, of course, we are very mindful of the risks out there and take extraordinary precautions and do a lot of checking and evaluation of any material we get. This is an unusual moment in our country's history and an unusual moment in journalism.
Let me ask
It's so
about,
unusual that you have to wonder.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. Let's get Greg off, and then we can speculate. You
Okay.
want to speculate that Donald
Well, I
Trump
wonder
got
if
on a
Greg
bike and drove over
speculated.
there and handed them to him because it would feed right into his narrative. But we'll speculate after we get Greg off. Greg, the one thing we would like to know, and obviously I didn't hear anybody criticize the Washington Post yesterday for making this decision. These would have gotten out anyway. That said, I'm sure you all felt a heavy burden in making the decision to release it. Can you just explain for our viewers the process that you and your editors went through before deciding to release these extraordinary documents?
Well, sure. I can tell you that we absolutely went to the White House before publishing any of this material. We told them what our intention was. We told them what we thought was significant in these transcripts and what we intended to emphasize in our coverage. And we have some comment in the story from officials familiar with these conversations defending the president's handling of these calls. There was no request. There was no request at any point in these discussions for us to withhold any of this information.
So the White House didn't...
And I should emphasize that happens from time to time. Clinton will know. I mean, we have these conversations frequently with the U.S. government about programs, covert programs and things like that. And, you know, the government doesn't always prevail when it comes to our news organization
But you're
or
saying
others.
the government, though, didn't ask you to withhold these?
Didn't even ask.
Didn't even ask, just let you do it, huh? Gene?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say basically that in my time at the Washington Post, I can think of probably, if I sat here for a while, dozens of instances where we came across sensitive information, went to U.S. officials beforehand and had a discussion about what could be published, what couldn't be published, what shouldn't be published. There is much that has been withheld over the years for national security reasons. It is, but everything's extraordinary these days. But it's extraordinary.
No, this is very
they didn't
extraordinary.
ask.
Yeah, all right. They
This
didn't
is-
even ask. That is extraordinary.
This-
The
they didn't
Washington
even want
Post,
you to-
Greg Miller, thank you so much. We greatly appreciate it.
Thank you.
So, Donnie, here's the operating theory that we heard people talk about last night, and that
Some might say.
some might say the fact that here you have this extraordinary leak that is damaging, supposedly, to the White House and damaging to our allies.
But really is damaging to the press.
But it
in
really
some
is
ways.
damaging to the press
And causes
because
more investigations.
everybody came out yesterday going, this is a shock. You saw it on TV. This is a shock. Suddenly people last night started saying, wait a second, did the Trump administration do a Nunes where Nunes announces, I've got this information and I'm going to tell the White House, but he had nothing, so he went to the White House. The White House gave him information. Then he came out and he said, I've got this information. I don't know.
Well,
It's starting to smell a little bit here,
yeah,
especially,
this is just-
by the way, I want somebody to give me an operating theory over the next 2 hours and 20 minutes. And Clint, you're going to have the first whack at this. Why wouldn't the White House say, don't release those transcripts? That will
That's wrong.
damage
Of course, by the way,
national security.
And interestingly enough, the transcripts, the stuff released,
Talking-
nothing was horribly damaging, but
No.
just enough
To hurt
for a
the press.
president to stand up. Go, look at that evil press. Look at the
demand an
enemy of this
investigation.
state.
They're leaking.
Look at what is going on here. I'm trying to run this
Oh, my
country.
God.
And the cosmopolitans and the elitists.
The
We need an
there
FBI
is cosmopolitan bias. By the way, you need to follow cosmopolitan bias on Twitter. But there is, these leaks are damaging to us. How dare they leak? I mean, Clint, I think.
Come on,
This
I
is,
think
this
we're
is a
being
president that
Nunes.
likes having bad relations with a lot of these leaders. It supports his bubble. We just saw that
By the way, that's a
crowd
verb.
in West
I've been
Virginia,
Nunesed.
and you want to keep bubbling them. You want to keep reinforcing it. And if anything, when they see that, they'll be like, you see what he said to the Mexican president? You see what he
funny.
did, to the Australian? They love that narrative. And at the same point, he becomes a victim again of the media.
It plays into Donald Trump's hands.
In,
and
in,
it's
in a
out.
sense, I mean, the
transcripts.
one caveat is the stuff he says about the wall, where he basically, if you read it, he basically says, yeah, this is not going to happen. You're not going to pay for it, but we can't say that. I'm not convinced that he would actually want that version of the story out there.
Well, he
who
said, you were
knows?
talking about the greatest hits at the top of the show, lock her up last night
Yeah.
in West Virginia. The other greatest hit was who's going to pay for the wall? And everyone, we were all at the events for 2 years, they would say, Mexico. So he said effectively in that phone call, which was made public, that was just politics. It's all going to come out in the wash. You're not going to have to pay
And he
for
just-
it. Don't worry,
he just
Mexico.
actually brought it out in the wash,
I don't
and now it's done.
But I'm not even convinced that matters anymore. Do you
It
think the people,
doesn't.
first of all, the
They don't
people
know.
in,
They don't
that room in
care.
West Virginia last night, they don't care
Oh,
about
my
that.
God.
He's just got the
Even-
headline that the press is leaking and they're out to get us and they're out to get
Right.
you and they're
But you put the
un-American.
wall comment together with what he said about New Hampshire.
Yeah.
Theoretically, that should damage him with the people
really
who
should.
elected him, but it will not.
By the way,
the people of New Hampshire will re-elect him.
Here's the deal. No, he lost New Hampshire.
Yes,
you don't
he did.
think he doesn't know that
I'm
he
joking.
lost New Hampshire? So he called them, instead of saying, this is my favorite place ever after the primary, now he's saying they're all drug addicts. My God, my friends, we have been Nunesed.
Well, I agree with you. Coming up, we'll talk to Senator Chris Coons, who's pushing bipartisan legislation to prevent President Trump from firing Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller without cause. Also with us, the top House Democrat on financial services, Congresswoman Maxine Waters joins us, and the Washington Post Bob Woodward joins the conversation. We'll be right back.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.